Welcome everyone to the very first online lecture for MSIN 0020, Strategy by Design. This first lecture is an introduction to the module. I'm going to share with you why I think you should be taking the module, and then I'm going to let you hear from alumni who took it in previous years about what they think they learned and how it's helped them in the rest of the management science course, in graduate school, in their first jobs, and also in the companies that they started. Okay, having heard from the teaching staff, we can now get on with the show. So today's agenda is I'm going to share with you some insights from module alumni. Then I'm going to give you an overview of the module from week to week. Next, I'm going to explain how I think you should be reading for this module, as well as how you should think about data and argument. All three of these are going to be really important to you for the final and the pre-writing assignments. And then, of course, at the very end, we'll talk about what the assignments are, what our expectations are about how you spread the work out throughout the semester, as well as how we will be grading you. Now, before we start, I should say a couple of things, or actually 5 things. The first one is this course is content light, but I've been told, thinking heavy. It may not be like the other modules you've done in university or before, so you should be ready for that. Much of the material, again, I've been told, is counterintuitive. So you should get ready to wrap your head around ideas that may not seem intuitive to you. We're going to try and make that possible and easy. But it's still going to be a challenge, which I think you're up for. The third thing is it requires you to read before watching lectures. At this point, I've shrunk the readings down quite a bit. If you don't do those readings before you watch the lectures, you may not really understand what the lectures are saying. So I encourage you to read before rather than after. And then for the final written assignment, as well as for the pre-writing assignments, we're going to require you to do research that's independent, that's defined and designed by you, and then executed by you. The really, really important last thing to say is this module definitely doesn't have definitely correct answers. The reason I'm including them in this introduction this year is because in previous years, I've heard from students during the module that they don't understand why they're doing it. It's really, really hard. It's a little bit traumatic. And the problem is a lot of those students, several years on, come back and they say, oh, you know what? I finally understand why we went through strategy by design. It was really useful to me in writing my dissertation, or it was really useful to me in thinking about the job that I'm doing, maybe as a consultant. Or actually, in some cases, it was really useful to me in thinking about strategy for the startup that I created. So I wanted to bring in some insights from alumni who have gone off after management science to do a range of different things, and also alumni of this module who are still in management science, so that you have an idea of what to expect this module can do for you, not right now, but into the future. So I tried to find people, obviously, who went off to do different things, as well as people who had finished this module a range of years in the past. So these represent students from anywhere from 1 year out to 3 or 4 years out from having done strategy by design. And you're going to hear from the founder of a startup that just finished Y Combinator, a technology consultant at EY, a graduate student at Columbia University, and also someone who at the time was a final year management science student. So how alumni have benefited. So they tell me that one of the real benefits, which at the time seemed like a big ask and really hard, is that you're forced to write with concision and clarity. And actually, more importantly, you are learning how to construct arguments that will convince other people to do what you want or believe what you say. And as this person says, I think this is essential in any corporate or business context. Like if you want someone to hire you, to adopt the plan that you suggest, or to give you a job in the first place, you need to argue with evidence to convince them to do the thing that you want. Now, I think another thing which students and alumni say is, after taking this module, you learn to make conclusions that you wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. So you now have basically a different perspective and a different way of thinking about how business works and how strategy works. And this is useful whether it's doing a competitor analysis for scenario week, for your dissertation, or when researching companies to apply for an internship or a graduate scheme. One thing which a lot of students come back to me after they finish, and in fact many years down the line, and they tell me is that this module is useful for personal development. I'm going to mention this a lot more this year because so much of strategy sounds like it should only be for business, but actually the way of thinking about what makes strategy good and how to come up with a strategy in the first place applies to all action, right? So it might be useful for figuring out what product to launch and how to launch it, but it also could be useful for figuring out what your personal career should look like and how you should get there. I think, as this person says, being able to use the module's approach to make a strong argument is applicable not only in business, but in a wide range of other things, many of which are entirely personal. Now, I think the most important thing is that what this module is trying to do is help you learn how to think critically about the goals that you have, the information you have available, and what actions you can take to achieve those goals given the information and resources that you have. In order to do that, you need to learn how to make better arguments, first to yourself and then to others. And as this person says at the very bottom of this slide, as an aspiring entrepreneur, he benefits a lot from having taken the module because being an entrepreneur is essentially about thinking critically about what markets look like and where you can produce something new, as well as how you can make arguments for that new thing to be successful. For instance, arguments that you should get funded, arguments that someone should join you as an employee. These are all arguments you need to make as an entrepreneur that I think, and also he thinks, that you can learn about by taking this module. Now, alumni also say that they had many things that they wish they had known at the beginning of taking this module, which I didn't tell them. So now I'm going to try and fix that. So one of the things, as I've mentioned already, is that in previous years, I've really not made as much of a big deal of how this way of thinking about strategy is relevant, not just for business, but for life in general. So this year, I'm going to try and do a little bit more of that. I think also it helps to know that this module is explicitly about not just strategy in a very limited context, but it's generally about how you take action to achieve goals, right? And those goals can be business goals, or as I've said many times before, they can be personal goals, or they can be personal career goals. One alumnus said, the module is more exciting and maybe more relevant if you think and apply the frameworks in personal goals and aspirations during the class. And I encourage you to do that. Alumni say that they wish that they had known that there would be quite a bit of reading. This, I'm telling you now, there will be reading, but also from when they took the class and when you're taking the class, I've reduced the reading by more than 50%. So now you're just having to read way less. Alumni also said that they wish they had known that writing well and concisely is essential to performing well in this module. And now I'm telling you, writing well and concisely is a must to perform well in this module. In order to do that, you should take the pre-writing assignments seriously. They're there, they seem kind of annoying, they're really short, you don't really know why you're doing them, but what they're really there for is to help force you to think about the final assignment really, really early on, precisely so that you have a good idea, you refine it, and you have clear focus. This will allow you to do well in the final write-up. Alumni also say that you really shouldn't be thinking about detail and facts and memorizing stuff, because this module is not about that at all. We want you to read efficiently and effectively to understand the main ideas of what we're trying to share with you, because the whole point of this is not for you to memorize a lot of stuff, but instead for you to understand how to think and then apply that way of thinking to questions that you want to answer. For instance, for this module, we're going to ask you to write a strategic analysis of a company of your choice. And we want you to apply these general ideas and ways of thinking to understanding whether or not this company is doing a good job, in your opinion. So we're not trying to get you to remember 35 frameworks or lots and lots of facts and regurgitate all those things. That is not what this module is for. This module is about understanding ways of thinking. And very crucially, this last thing on this slide, using your own judgment. This is really, really important. I think a lot of the angst, a lot of the trauma of students in previous years was not really believing that we were truthful when we said you really can use your own judgment. Many things in this module we leave up to you. You can choose whatever company you want to focus on for your case analysis, which is the final assignment. You can choose how you want to do it. All you have to do is explain why you think it's a good idea to do it that way. Using your own judgment is it's a foundational part of how we think about how this module runs. It's not a trick. We leave things ambiguous or vague intentionally, not as some kind of like trap for you. And you really do have freedom to do that stuff in that area. Where we want you to be parameterized, we do tell you. For instance, we're not going to let you have an infinitely long assignment. It's maximum 16 pages long, and we tell you exactly how we want it formatted. But outside of everything that we tell you, you have complete freedom, and you should take it. Now, alumni also have suggestions about workload. So many alumni come back to me, at the end of the module or several years after, and they say, thinking back, the strategy by design assignment was probably the one that took up the most headspace. It wasn't really time spent working, like you're not spending weeks writing things. What you're doing is you're actually just spending a lot of effort thinking through things, right? So remember I said earlier on, it's content light and thinking heavy. It's not really about spending a lot of time just doing a lot of make work. It's about spending a lot of time thinking about how you're going to make an argument about the company that you're talking about for your strategic analysis, which is the final assignment. So alumni almost universally say that if you want to do well in this, you need discipline to start early so that you can allocate time to thinking about the assignment every week and doing a bit of work on it. Another thing that alumni say, and I completely agree with, is that for the final assignment, we ask you to focus on the strategic analysis of a company or an organization. You can choose whatever you want. If you pick an organization that you are not fascinated by, that you find really boring, learning enough about that company or organization to write a good assignment is likely to also be really boring because you don't really care about what they do. On the other hand, if you're really excited about what that company does, learning enough about it to write a good case analysis could actually even be fun. Now, I'm not saying all of you will be able to pull this off, but if you learn enough about a company, sometimes it's a really good way to get hired by them. So an alumnus in this module actually did this. He went and studied a car company and did actually quite a good final assignment on it. And then he went and approached someone very senior at the company here in London and said, I learned so much about your company. I wrote this analysis. I think your strategy is great. Will you hire me? And they actually did. So this assignment for this module could actually pay off not only in terms of teaching you how to write and think, but could also pay off in bigger ways, especially if you take it in the spirit that is intended, right? It's a way to learn something and possibly have fun learning something. It won't be easy, but it might be fun, and it might be fruitful and useful for you as well. Alumni also say, as I have already said, that if you don't do the readings, you probably won't be able to follow the lectures. And if you don't follow the lectures, you probably won't do well in the coursework, which means you get a low grade for this module. Nobody wants that. Alumni also tell me, and this is something which I know is very, very difficult for a lot of us, interacting during the sync sessions is super important. Learning how to say things cogently in class is a way of learning how to say things cogently when you're in a working environment. Like, you want to be able to contribute to conversations in ways that are meaningful. And it's a skill. If you don't learn it in school, you will have to learn it at some point. And you might as well learn it in school when it's very, very low stakes. Okay, the final thing that alumni say about workload. Using your own judgment doesn't just apply to the final assignment and its content. It's generally sort of the whole module is about using your own judgment, right? The assignments are very much open in terms of scope, as this alumnus says. This is not accidental. In fact, it actually takes us more time to grade these assignments and to design this module because the assignments are open-ended. So we're doing it by great intention. And you shouldn't expect, and we definitely will not be spoon-feeding you with answers. Like, what we want is for you to come up with arguments based on what frameworks we provide to you, there are no clear answers that are factually true in strategy, in my opinion. So, why this module? I think, and alumni also think, that there are three main reasons. The first one is you learn to think better and differently, and this is useful because thinking differently sets you apart from other people you're competing with, so that you learn to make compelling arguments with data, and you learn to write well and concisely, both of which are important both in personal life and in your job in the future. And all this is relevant for your dissertation to come, for your future job, startup, or grad school. If you did the readings for this week, you'll know that one of the main animating questions for this whole module is the question of what strategy actually is. I have a simple seeming answer, which is that strategy is choosing actions that result in comparatively better performance for the organization. Now, this is simple seeming because actually each one of these words has a wide potential range of meaning, and how we interpret this sentence affects what we think of as good strategy. So this module exists so that we can unpack the meaning of these words and then think together about what it means to choose actions that result in comparatively better performance for the organization. What actions are we choosing from? What does comparatively mean? What does better mean? What does performance mean? So I think at this point, I want to give you an outline of the module. What's going to happen from week to week? So the course outline, as you know, you have 8 weeks of time that are outside of your scenario weeks for this module. We are going to, in these 8 weeks, first learn about and then use some frameworks for thinking about action. So remember earlier on I said that strategy was about choosing actions. First of all, we need to have a framework for thinking about what action actually is and how we actually think about what actions to choose. Importantly, a framework is not a static collection of knowledge or facts or things to do. A lot of the time, strategy is misunderstood as just this list of things to do, and if you do them, you'll be successful. I think, and I hope you eventually agree, that strategy should instead be a framework, right? It's a way of thinking about what action to take, not a set of actions to take, because things change. And if things are changing, frameworks can adapt, but sets of things that are static cannot. So one opening question is, what is a framework in the first place? For me, a framework consists of 4 sets of things. The first one is, what data or areas are you even considering or paying attention to in the first place? I'll give you an example of this. Let's say you are a business owner. Let's say you own a laundromat. If you own a laundromat and you're interested in getting more people to use your services for dry cleaning, you may choose to pay attention to some kinds of data or some areas of your business and not others. What might those be? So one area to actually probably think about and pay attention to is who is living in your neighborhood. Like laundromats are very local businesses. It would make sense to understand who lives there so that you can maybe provide a service offering that appeals to them. If you live in an area that is very wealthy, where people, work in offices where they wear suits and expensive shirts all the time, you may choose to offer a premium dry cleaning service that you can charge more for. Maybe it's faster or it's more attention to detail. That may be an area to pay attention to because it makes sense to pay attention to it. You have to make a reason for why you choose to pay attention to this area or this type of data. What might you think of as data or areas not to pay attention to if you're this laundromat owner? Maybe, I don't know, the color of the floor in the back office. Like it may be green or pink or blue, but if the customer doesn't see it, it probably doesn't make very much sense to pay attention to it if you're worried about what customers are thinking about your business, right? So any framework, first of all, thinks and makes a conscious attempt to understand what data and areas to consider or pay attention to and which ones not to consider and not to pay attention to. A second aspect of frameworks is what methods you choose for collecting the data that you've decided to consider or pay attention to. So returning to the example of the laundromat owner, if you're interested in collecting data about the neighborhood and what kind of demographics they have, some methods for collecting data that make sense might be to go to the local business association and ask to buy information that they've collected about who lives in the neighborhood. Another method that might be valid would be to survey people as they come in through the shop, right? So someone comes in, you give them a survey, they fill it out, they give it back to you. That tells you something about the people who come through. It may not make sense to buy, for instance, national level data that does contain information about your neighborhood, but at a level of granularity that is so coarse that you don't understand the detail that you need to understand your neighborhood so that you can provide a service to them that they actually want to buy. A third aspect of frameworks is ways of interpreting the data that you've actually collected. How do you use the data that you've collected in relation to the other data you've collected to understand what it means? So data by itself is just data. It's only when you look at all that data and you make an interpretation of it, you figure out what it's trying to tell you, that's when you begin to get into the realm of action, right? So returning again to the laundromat owner, let's say that you find out that 70% of the people in your neighborhood work at home. They don't go to the office. They don't have to get suits dry cleaned all the time. Do you interpret that as meaning that they are not going to want dry cleaning services? What if you also had information from a separate source that said that 50% of people in your neighborhood go out all the time? They go out 4 or 5 times a week. And they like going to, because it's a wealthy neighborhood, they like going to the opera and other things like that where you have to dress up when you go out. Would you still interpret the data that they don't go out to work in offices the same way? That interpretation being that they won't need dry cleaning services? Actually, you might change your mind, right? So bringing data together so that it informs the other data that you collected so that you can interpret it differently is important. And a framework includes ways of thinking about how you're going to interpret data in relation to other data. Finally, a fourth aspect of a framework is systems that you have for acting on the data. So once you've decided what the data means, you need to decide how you're going to act on it. Now, there's lots of different kinds of systems for acting on data, but I'll just give you one example of it. Let's say that you're, again, this laundromat owner, and you're actually part of a national chain of laundromats. And as part of the franchising, you get a standard operating procedure booklet. Like it's a manual for what you do in any given situation. Now, if the data that you've collected and interpreted says that you're in a particular situation that is in the book, you simply act based on what the book says you should do, right? That's a system for acting on data. Here is a collection of things that you should do given situations that you might face. And you look at the situation, figure out which situation it is, and then act based on what the book tells you. That's a system for acting on data. A different system for acting on data might be to say, okay, I've found some information, I've interpreted it, and I've come up with some idea of what it means. Now what I'm going to do is, instead of just looking in a book that has a protocol or some guidance for acting in every possible situation, I'm going to try and figure it out. I'll experiment. So the standard operating procedure system for acting on data requires that you've pre-established more or less what you do in any situation. Whereas this alternative, which I'm proposing, might be something like experimentation, right? You might be able to say that my system for acting on data is to collect some data, try and make sense of it, and then try something new. Like based on what I found this week or this month, I'm going to introduce a new service. Maybe I'm introducing a service for express dry cleaning of opera clothing, like clothing that you would wear if you go to the opera or some other event where you have to dress up, because maybe some people like it. Maybe what I'll do is I'll open later on nights when I know that there is an operatic performance so that people who are going can pick up their clothing just before they go, maybe. So these two ways of acting on data represent different systems, and there's probably many, many more. But a framework consists of at least these four things, right? What data to consider or pay attention to, how you collect that data, how you interpret the data once you've collected it, and how you act on that data once you've interpreted it. So just to bring the thread back to where I started when I started talking about frameworks, this module is not going to present to you a static block of like things to do that are strategic. Instead, what this module is going to try and do is to share with you a framework that is very general, and it's about how to think about what action to take. And it's general so that it applies not only to business, but also to things like personal life, to career. So, with that in mind, what actually will you be learning? And when will you be learning it? Today is week 7. We're just doing the introduction, which is the overview of the module, as I've said. Next week, we get into the real meat of things for the first time. Strategic goals are the foundation of strategy. You cannot understand what corporations are doing unless you understand what they're doing it for. So next week, we talk about goals and how values affect them. On Tuesday next week, there will be an optional writing workshop that Tom will run. It won't run at the same time as the sync sessions do. And I encourage you to come if you have questions about your choice of organization for the final writing assignment, or if you have questions about assignment A1. In week 9, we begin the first of 2 weeks on strategic analysis. The first week is about how to do the analysis in the first place. And in that week, pre-writing assignment A1 is due. On that Friday, there will be the first writing workshop during which collectively we discuss that first pre-writing assignment. And then in week 10, we go to the second part of strategic analysis, which is what to analyze. After that, we go into reading and scenario weeks. And when we come back, we do 3 weeks of strategic response, where the framework of goals, how to analyze stuff and what to analyze, then get applied to specific case studies as an illustration of how to think about looking at companies and what they do through the lens of the framework that we've developed. So the first week of strategic response, week 13, we look at how to think about companies responding to things that are happening in the environment around them. In the second week of that, which is week 14, we look at how companies respond to resource issues inside them. And then in the last week of strategic response, we look at open-endedness. What happens when companies have to respond to situations which are unfolding as we speak? So in week 13, right after you come back from reading week and scenario week, assignment 2 is due. And that Friday, there will be a sync session, which will be a writing workshop on pre-writing assignment A2. And then in week 15, just 2 weeks later, your final assignment will be due. So week 16, after all that's done, will just be a conclusion where we talk a little bit about applying the framework that we've developed and the learnings that we've made to personal development and career development. This week's readings pose the question, what is strategy? It's a good question. At its most basic, strategy is simply choosing to take intentional actions to achieve goals. Just to be clear about that, if you accidentally do something and it achieves something which you didn't plan for it to achieve, that's not strategy. But beyond that, one of the most influential thinkers in strategy today, Michael Porter, whose thinking we're going to be exploring in the next few slides, makes a very good point. Even being good at what you do is not the same thing as strategy. Good strategy is only good when it is unique, right? The things that you do, nobody else does. When the trade-offs are correctly chosen, which means to say that you've chosen to do the right things and also chosen not to do the right things. And then finally, when there is fit between the things that you've chosen to do. Now, these 3 characteristics in combination make good strategy hard to imitate. So let's go a little bit deeper into the first of these 3 aspects of what makes good strategy according to Porter, uniqueness. What can organizations do to choose the set of activities they engage in so that they are unique? For Porter, the answer is focus, by which he means choosing to do some things but not other things, but making that decision carefully. So focus for Porter can happen in one or more of 3 ways. The The first way is to focus on the variety of things or services that you supply. So one example of this might be a pen company. If you are a pen company entering into a market where there are lots of producers of really inexpensive pens and also medium price pens, but no producers of ultra premium super luxury pens, you might choose to produce ultra premium super luxury pens because you're good at design, you've got access to premium materials. And if you do that, you would become unique in terms of the activities you engage in based on the variety of items that you supply. Another way of focusing is by focusing on the needs of those being supplied, not the variety of things that you're supplying necessarily. So an example of this might be a hotel, right? That's in a city where most of the hotels serve business travelers and are located in the center of the city and are fairly expensive, where the rooms are nice, but they're fairly small because most business travelers travel solo. If you're opening a new hotel, you might choose to focus on the needs of a group that is not currently being supplied, such as family travelers, who are generally more price sensitive, and you might open a hotel a little bit further out of the city center with more robust furnishings and fittings so that children and pets can play and not mess things up too much, as well as larger rooms so that there are more beds for families to travel and stay together. Now, if you did that, you would be focusing on a different need that is not currently being filled in the market, and therefore you might also be engaging in a set of unique activities. A third way of being unique in terms of the activities that you undertake as an organization is by focusing on access. Now, as Porter says, this is maybe the least well understood and the least frequently used form of thinking about uniqueness. But a good way of thinking about this might be in terms of geography, right? So the example Porter uses is businesses that choose to conduct their business and target customers who are in rural areas, provide services and create sets of activities that are defined by the fact that their customers come from only those areas. Imagine if you're providing, for instance, cinemas. You're building cinemas in cities that are small. The way you do it, because you are usually the only cinema in that town or that small city, will be very different from if you are providing cinema services in a big city where you're competing with lots and lots of other cinemas. So if you're in a small town, you will have to provide cinema services that cover a wide range of different kinds of movies because you are the only cinema in town. Whereas if you were in the city center, you might specialize in a certain type of movie, like you might be an art house theater, because there are lots and lots of other cinemas around that can provide other kinds of cinematic entertainment. So the idea of focusing on access is you look to see who can get to the service or product that you're supplying, and then you supply that product. Let's now move to the second aspect of what Porter thinks makes for good strategy, which is trade-offs. Trade-offs exist because resources cannot ever be infinite. No organization or person has infinite money or time or energy. And when resources aren't infinite, the only way you can do the some things that really matter is when you decide that you're willing to not do other things that don't matter as much. Trade-offs simply mean not doing everything. Now, what makes a trade-off strategic is when you choose the trade-offs that you're willing to make rather than having them be forced on you. So we've already heard that trade-offs exist because resources aren't infinite. But practically, why do businesses even have to make trade-offs? So for Porter, trade-offs exist for businesses because not all business activities work well with each other. In fact, some of them clash. Right? So for Porter, activities can be inconsistent from a marketing perspective. What this means, just one good example might be, if you're trying to manufacture and you have successfully branded a very upmarket, extremely luxurious product that's very expensive, it would be inconsistent to try and sell that product to a down-market customer base that really just wants a cheap product and doesn't care about the luxuriousness of it. So in order to solve this inconsistency, you might have to just decide we're going to abandon this potentially very large down-market customer base and focus only on a potentially very small up-market customer base that cares about the quality and doesn't care about the price. Activities can also be incompatible, just practically. And just going back to the example of this luxurious product, it may be incompatible with the luxurious, high quality nature of this product to make it out of cheap, low grade ingredients. And so to solve this incompatibility, you have to make a trade off, right? You have to say, I'm willing to not save money on cheap ingredients. Instead, I have to spend a lot of money on expensive, high spec ingredients so that I can achieve the level of quality in the final product that I'm hoping for. Finally, activities can simply be confusing for employees if companies don't choose what they're trying to do. A company that is trying to be all things to all customers naturally creates confusion for employees because employees then have to be all things to all customers. It's much better if the company makes a trade-off by saying we're not going to do the following 35 things and we're only going to focus on these 2 things. And finally, let's move on to the third aspect of Porter's idea of what constitutes good strategy, which is fit. Fit for Porter consists in coherence among a business's multifarious activities. And by coherence, he simply means, at the very least, that they do not conflict with each other. And the reason why fit is important is because businesses need to do at least a few activities. And in fact, the more activities a business does and the more interrelated they are, i.e., the more complex and coherent the business model, the harder it is for competitors to replicate, the more unique it gets. For Porter, there are 3 levels of fit that are progressively more strategic, if you will. The bottom level, which is the baseline, is simply consistency between activities that the business undertakes, making sure that the activities don't conflict with each other, that they don't clash. One level above that is reinforcement, when activities that the business undertakes reinforce other activities. So one example might be if a business manufactures a product and also builds a range of stores in which people can come and buy the product that are really beautiful, that create a great brand around the product. What that might do is it might make it more likely that other kinds of businesses, like let's say hotels or resorts, might want to use these products in their hotels or resorts because of the brand name associated with the shops that these products are sold in. And what that does is it creates this association. Guests going to those hotels or resorts that are very upmarket see this product, and they're more likely then to go find it in retail shops that are themselves upmarket. The 2 activities that this company does, one of them is building beautiful stores in which to sell its own products and also trying to place its products inside upmarket hotels. They reinforce each other. Now, the third level is a little bit harder to explain, but it's mutual optimization. It's when the activities that a business undertakes are not only reinforcing each other, but in some way, they're mutually dependent on each other. They couldn't happen without each other. So in the previous example, you could imagine that the business might be able to run a retail strategy on its own, or it might be able to run a hotel placement strategy on its own, by which I mean it might be able to open stores to sell its own products without trying to sell to hotels, or it might be able to sell to hotels without running its own stores to sell its own product. Now, mutual optimization means that the 2 activities only work when both activities are done in relation to each other. So one example of this might be fast fashion. Famously, Zara, which we're going to read a case on next week, has an in-store experience and infrastructure that allows its design team and its production team to know very quickly what is selling and what's popular, so that that design team can very quickly design stuff that is more like that and send it to the production team that can very quickly produce and deliver it to stores. None of this stuff would be possible if all of it wasn't happening together. Like, you cannot have a store that depends on very rapid reactions from design and production without having a design and production team that is fast to act. The design and production teams cannot be fast to act unless they've got stores where people are buying constantly and the store management and store staff are sending information back to the design team and the production team. So all these parts of Zara's activity need to happen, and they're mutually optimized with each other. Stores that sell stuff quickly and that report information back to design and production that receive information from the stores and can act quickly to design new things and produce them. What we've heard so far is one perspective on strategy, which is very much the mainstream. It's very conventional strategy at the moment, and it has real value. What Porter is saying is To do good strategy, you need to do a lot of thinking to figure out how to be unique in terms of what activities you decide to do, how to make trade-offs so that you choose the right activities, and how to make sure that they all fit together, right? So if you achieve fit, uniqueness, and the right set of trade-offs, you've got good strategy. Now, there is a problem with this though. It's good, but there's a problem. And the problem is, as Roger Martin says, everyone knows that strategy is really important. But the whole point of strategy is about figuring out how to confront a future that always is not fully known. And our natural reaction as people is to try and reduce that challenge, right? Let's try and pretend that we can solve this problem of not knowing what the future will be with tools like trying to figure out uniqueness and fit and trade-offs and spending a long time building a very comprehensive, very detailed plan for what the company will do. At the end of this process, as Martin says, everyone feels a lot less scared. But it's a terrible way to make strategy, because what you're really doing with strategy there is you're using it as a way to cope with fear of the unknown. Instead of that way of thinking about strategy as the product of hours of careful research and modeling that lead to an inevitable and almost perfect conclusion, Martin believes, and I agree with him, that strategy should instead be the result of a simple, quite rough and ready process of thinking through what it would take to achieve what you want and then assessing whether it's realistic to try. If you think back to what I said about what this module is about, it's actually about this rough and ready, very simple framework of thinking about how to achieve the goals that you've decided you're trying to achieve, given the constraints and resources that are available to you. The two underlying problems of conventional strategy are: it makes really detailed, exhaustively planned out strategies that assume that the future is, in a sense, knowable, without acknowledging that there is never any way of saying for sure what the future will be. And the second one, which may be more important, is that it makes assumptions about goals that companies are trying to achieve, even when those assumptions may not hold. So the reason why this module is called Strategy by Design is that I think that design thinking can fix some of these problems with conventional strategy. To understand why, I think we first have to ask, what is design? Herbert Simon, all around very brilliant guy, but also a design theorist, says everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into desired ones. This so-called science of the artificial doesn't simply deal with what currently is. It really forces us to think, what do we want it to become? It deals with what could be. And one other thing I should say about design is I don't think of design as outputs, like a piece of software or a teapot or whatever. I think of design as a process. So for me, the process has 5 parts. You specify the goal or the problem you're trying to solve. You do some research on it. You use that research to develop some hypotheses. You test or implement those hypotheses, and then you evaluate the test. Based on that evaluation, you might go back to re-specifying the goal or the problem, and then you just iterate again. You go through the research, hypothesis development, testing, evaluation process until the solution you find meets the goal or solves the problem, and then you can stop. So design processes have no sort of like determinate beginning or end point. You can actually start anywhere in these 5 things you do as part of design. It's a simple way of saying how you get from the place you currently are to the place you want to go, right? It's a very simple and fluid, rough and ready approach to thinking about how to get there from where you are right now. Is conventional strategy so different from design? I would argue not really. Why is it strategy by design? Because strategy, if you recall, simply consists of choosing actions that result in comparatively better performance for the organization. This involves analyzing the environment, identifying appropriate actions, and implementing appropriate actions. Comparatively better performance for the organization is often defined as profitability, growth, sales, survival, or innovation. Strategy has 2 parts. You choose the actions, and you have to also sort of choose what means comparatively better performance for the organization. Now, if we think about what design is, Everyone designs or devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into desired ones. And changing existing situations into desired ones involves identifying what makes a situation desirable, searching for courses of action, testing courses of action to produce desired outcomes, and modifying these actions if they don't produce the desired outcomes. Now, design asks important questions which I think most strategy doesn't ask. It asks questions like, what goals do I want to achieve in the first place? How will I know when I've been successful at achieving that goal? And how much time and effort should I spend searching for possible goals to pursue? So, strategy by design really is about using design and these other questions that design asks to supplement what strategy means, right? So, not only do we get to think about profitability, growth, sales, survival, innovation, we might also, if we're thinking about what goals we're trying to pursue, think about quality, sustainability, staff welfare, identity, things like that. And so, strategy by design really is about a rough and ready way of thinking about a strategic framework that builds in some ideas from design to understand how to respond strategically to a situation in a way that is relevant to business and also to the individual. And strategy by design, the framework that we're going to present to you, basically has three components. The first one is really trying to understand what the goals are. The second one is understanding the situation. And then the third one is figuring out how to respond. And as you'll see as the module progresses, this idea of goals, situation, response, this three-part way of thinking about how to analyze any given strategic situation, this is what we'll apply to the case analyses we'll do in the first half of the class, as well as in the response analyses that we'll do in the second half of the class when we get back from scenario week and reading week. So bear this in mind. This slide is essentially the entire class in a nutshell. In order to understand the strategy of a company or your own strategy, what you need to do is you need to think first about understanding what goals you or the company are trying to pursue, then trying to figure out what's going on in the situation, the environment, the internal environment, and then trying to figure out, based on the goals and the situation you or the company are in, what an appropriate situational response might be to try and achieve the goals you're trying to achieve. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you next week, and I hope you have a good rest of the week this week.